Thank you, everybody, for coming today in order to participate with us. This is a really special, kind of exciting program. We have as our guest, Dr. Thomas Jay Oord. He's a theologian, philosopher, and scholar of multidisciplinary studies. He's a best-selling and award-winning author. He has written or edited more than 25 books on really fascinating topics. One of the ones from this year is Open and Relational Theology, an Introduction to Life-Changing Ideas. And he's also done questions and answers for God Can't. He's a 12-time faculty award-winning professor. He teaches around the globe. He directs a doctoral program at the Northwind Theological Seminary at the Center for Open and Relational Theology. And he's known for his contributions to research on love, open and relational theology, science and religion, and the implications of freedom and relationships for transformation. He also has a really cool blog post. If you get the chance, you can go to his website, and he even has free downloads there. It's kind of nice. The topic for today is science and ever creation, the universe, time, and creativity. Tom, it's all yours.
Well, thanks for that very, very nice introduction, Gail. And thanks to Maynard and CJ and to Ricky, who will be giving a response later. Thanks to all of you for giving me the opportunity to share some big ideas with you all. And I want to thank you who are watching, listening to this. I want to warn you going into this lecture that I'm going to be throwing out some, I think, new ideas, at least new ideas to many of you. Some of these ideas will probably seem to come out of left field, but I've been propelled or compelled to come at these ideas based on certain intuitions I have, my work with science, philosophy, and theology, and the centrality of the questions of love, creaturely love, divine love, what that's like. And so this will all kind of be mixed into the proposals I have to share with you today. I'm going to be using a PowerPoint, so let me go to share my screen here, and we'll just dive right into things. Most of you probably know that among the theists of this planet, especially Christians, Jews, and Muslims, the majority affirm an idea that is in Latin called creatio ex nihilo. It literally means God exists and created this universe from absolute nothingness. Now, sometimes that word nothing in creation out of nothing is kind of massaged, and it's really a something. It might be a chaos or a formless void, or it's not absolutely nothing. But most of the original proposers of the ideas, and I suspect, at least from my reading, most theologians and philosophers today who call themselves theists want to say that this nothingness is true nothingness, that God started from nothing whatsoever and then somehow can create something, a universe, from absolute nothingness. Most of the contemporary scholars in the science of religion discussion take the science straightforwardly and seriously. And the science today suggests that our universe is roughly 13.8 billion years old. I affirm that. I'll be operating from that assumption throughout my discussion today. But many of them who believe in creation out of nothing will sometimes say, maybe not very carefully, but they'll say, well, the Big Bang supports creation out of nothing. And part of my proposal today is to both affirm the Big Bang, but also to reject creation out of nothing. So here's the big thesis that I want to defend in the next 12 or 15 slides. The creation from nothing view, I think, should be thrown out, should be rejected. But we should replace it with an alternative creation theory. And today, I'm going to propose one. So it's not just that I think there's problems with creation out of nothing view and we should get rid of it and then there's nothing to replace it. I'm going to propose an alternative and let you ask questions and ponder that possibility. Let me start with what I consider are some real problems with this ancient view emerged around the 3rd century that God exists and created this universe out of absolutely nothing, creation out of nothing. First of all, this is one that folks maybe don't think about very often, but if it's the case that God creates out of nothing, and God could have not created, God may or may not create. That's the standard view amongst most Muslims and Christians, at least, and probably most Jewish scholars, although I'm not as up on that scholarship. But if it's the case that God didn't have to create, could have remained in absolute isolation, well, this implies that creating isn't something God has to do. We might even say God is a little c instead of big C creator. If we think big C creator means a necessary attribute of the divine nature. But most Christians and Muslims and Jews that I know of will say, nope, God didn't have to create. God could have remained forever in isolation, which means then that creating isn't something necessary or essential to what it means to be divine. The second point is one that I first turned to, or actually kind of first compelled me to begin to question the creation out of nothing view. It says that if creation out of nothing is correct, this implies a particular view of God's power, that God has a kind of ability that is unique to God, would say most people who believe in creation out of nothing. And that is the ability to create out of absolutely nothing and therefore have that kind of omnipotent power. Now, if God's got that kind of power, it seems like, if assuming God's loving, maybe you wouldn't want to assume that, but assuming God's loving, which most theists assume, God would want to use that power to prevent the genuine evils of the world. And yet, most of us, I would even argue all of us, most of us want to say there are some things that occur in the world that make it worse than it might have been, a genuine evil. So we start to wonder what's going on here. If creation out of nothing is going to affirm a particular view of God's power, God's omnipotence, it seems like God's on the hook for the possibility of evil and the actuality. And in fact, when the creation from nothing view was first proposed in about the 2nd or 3rd century by a couple of Gnostics, at least historically, that's what we've been able to determine, or that some of the historical theologians have determined. It was the early Christian theologian Irenaeus. Oops, I've got a mistake there. That should say Tertullian. Whoops. Anyway, who says that the will of God must rule and dominate in everything. In other words, many of the early Christian church fathers saw a connection between a God who can create out of nothing and a God who's in control, has omnipotent power, can rule and dominate in everything. And this idea continues to be prominent today. Let me quote one of my friends, Alvin Plantinga. He believes in creation out of nothing, and he extends that into the present time and says, I love this quote, "It's entirely possible for God to create a full-grown horse in the middle of Times Square without violating the principle of the conservation of energy." In other words, what Plantinga is saying, and I think he's right if you affirm creation out of nothing, that the God who had the ability to create out of nothing 13.8 billion years ago would retain that ability today. And so in his illustration, God could, bang, instantaneously create a full-grown horse in Times Square. Well, if you take that seriously, which I think you should, that really creates problems for understanding evil in the world. I mean, that would mean then that God has the ability to instantaneously create steel walls between bullets and their innocent victims. God could instantaneously create a net to catch someone falling out of a plane. I mean, once your mind starts going out all the possibilities of the things that this God who allegedly can create from nothing could do, my goodness, it seems like the problem of evil becomes unsolvable, insurmountable, insoluble. In other words, A God who can create from nothing seems to be morally culpable for failing to prevent the genuine evils in the world. And a God who is morally culpable is not perfectly loving. So that's the second reason why I want to reject creation out of nothing. Third, it comes as a surprise to many, it did to me initially, that there's no explicit biblical support for this idea of creation out of nothing. Genesis chapter 1, first couple of verses actually talks about there being water on the face of the deep. The closest one might come to an explicit biblical claim would be a Second Maccabees passage that actually talks about compares the creation of the world to a woman's womb, which a woman's womb is not nothingness. But in the New Testament, the most explicit claim, and there are some other claims about God creating, but the most explicit claim about God creating is in 2 Peter. Long ago, by God's word, the heavens came into being, and the earth was formed out of water and by means of water. If we look at the Christian scriptures, over and over again, God is talked about creating in relation to something. Now, true, sometimes it says God creates by the power of God's word, and God calls something into being. But it's interesting to look at the particular passages related to those calling into creation instances. Probably the most common one is in Romans, and there the Apostle Paul is talking about calling a people into existence, the people of Israel. But I don't think most people think that, all of a sudden, a whole bunch of people instantaneously started existing. I think what we normally think of in interpreting that passage is that God calls in the sense of luring people, their heart of hearts, their minds, however you want to think of God's call. But the people already existed, and then they come together to form something new. So even creating by the power of the word, I would want to suggest, assumes there's something that will respond to the call of that word. Number 4, this is one that's been particularly important to me as of late. I think we've got I'm very confident we've got a climate crisis on our hands. If you think God can create, boom, something out of nothing. In fact, this planet was just created out of nothing, and God could, boom, just send it back into nothingness. You might start to wonder why you should do all kinds of sacrificial actions to prevent or stop or at least slow down climate change. You might wonder why you should even care about this creation. If it's something God can just spring out of nothingness and send back into nothingness, is it really essentially important to the divine plan? There are a number of people who share this concern with me, and there have been essays written on this issue, linking the problem of creation out of nothing and the motive for creation care or climate concern. Number 5, although it's true that many people who affirm creation out of nothing link it to the Big Bang, I don't think we should say that creation out of nothing itself has scientific support. There still remains the question, of course, for those of us, and I'm one, who affirm the Big Bang, and that is the question, what was prior to the Big Bang? And while there are plenty of metaphysical proposals, and I'm going to give one myself here today, the metaphysical proposals for what is prior to the Big Bang is not something that I think science, at least as we know it, can give us any kind of conviction about. It's a metaphysical claim, not a scientific one. I'll come back to that a little later. Also, I think not just I, but philosophers for quite some time have said that out of nothing comes nothing. Ex nihilo nihil fit. That is, that metaphysically, we don't know of any instances in which something can emerge out of absolute nothingness. There's always a something. It may be what emerges is radically different from what it came from, but there always seems to be something from which something new emerges. And so this creation out of nothing idea doesn't make sense, at least on most notions of what metaphysical possibilities entail. So I think we need a different proposal. I think we should reject creation out of nothing and adopt this alternative doctrine of creation to overcome the problems I've mentioned. Now, I want to suggest to you kind of the framework, the principles, you might say, that at least I think we need to have. I think other people probably agree with most of these, maybe all of them. But in order to have a compelling alternative creation to creation out of nothing, what should be some of the parameters or principles or objectives that this new doctrine ought to meet? First of all, I happen to be a Christian, but other theists will have their own scriptures to appeal to. I think this creation doctrine should at least be consonant with the general witness of Scripture. And although I've not gone into detail here, I have in other writings, I'm just, as I read Scripture, over and over again, the biblical writers talk about God creating out of something. The analogies they use are creators who create out of something. So an alternative doctrine I'm going to suggest here would fit this general biblical witness. Secondly, it would say that when God created our universe, God didn't stumble upon or happen upon some stuff that was kind of just lying around. God saying, whoa, where did that come from? Hey, there's some stuff out there. I don't know where that came from. I think I might make a universe. Rather, it would say that everything that exists has God as creator. If it's actually existing thing, God plays at least some creative role in its having in its existence. Third, I think to be compelling, it would continue to say that God doesn't depend on this stuff for God's own existence. There might be some ways in which God depends upon creation, but not in the sense that God would stop existing if creation stopped existing. Philosophically, this is called aseity or ase in Latin. That is, God necessarily exists, and God doesn't depend upon creatures to exist. However, I've got no problem saying that creation depends upon the creator for its existence. So there will be some asymmetry there in terms of dependence. Fourth, similarly actually to three, but this says God exists necessarily and everlastingly. However, no world, universe, creature, entity, no created thing exists everlastingly and necessarily. Every created thing is contingent. It has a beginning. Only God is beginningless. Number four, I think this theory ought to support the work that so many of us feel like we should be doing to combat climate change, to support ecological justice. In other words, it would have a view of reality that says that creation isn't just dispensable. God can just say, well, tough, that was a bad run there. I'm going to scratch it all and start from nothing again. No, there's something inherently, intrinsically valuable. And that's one of the reasons why we ought to be motivated to care for this planet and its creatures. Number six, I think it should entail a view of God's power that doesn't make God morally responsible, culpable for failing to prevent genuine evil. Now, this is a huge topic. It's one that I've addressed in several books. It's one that I take very seriously. I think we need to rethink God's power, throw out the classic view of omnipotence, still have a powerful God, but not a God who is a controlling kind of God. If we do that, then I think we can sidestep the number one reason, according to polls, that atheists say God doesn't exist. Number seven, because love is very important to me and to so many theists I know, this alternative theory could make love God's motive and God's method when creating. You see, one of the problems with the creation out of nothing view is if God doesn't have to create and God could just continue existing everlastingly, whatever that looks like, timelessly, It doesn't seem like God has to love anybody or anything. Love isn't a necessary aspect of God's nature, at least not love for creatures, maybe within Trinity, but not love for creation. But this alternative view could say God's love for creation is necessary to God's very nature. And the way God creates is not coercive, not overpowering, not single-handed or unilateral, but always in collaboration and cooperation, which is so important in talking about loving actions. Number 8, it would say that this creating is actually necessary to God. I started my lecture, or this lecture, by saying one of the problems, in my view, with the classical view that God once existed all alone and didn't have to create any world is that God isn't necessarily a creator in that view. But in the view I want to propose, God must create. It's God's very nature to do so. God is the capital C creator. So I've been teasing it long enough. Let me lay it out there. This is the basics of this new doctrine of creation that I want us to explore today. It says this: God always, and when I mean always, I mean everlastingly. God always and lovingly creates out of or in relation to creation. God's not creating out of nothing. God's always creating out of creation or in relation to it, in love. And by always, I mean always. And if you really care about the Latin, there's the Latin. So to add a little bit more to it, God creates moment by moment something new. It's not just rearranging something that was there, something absolutely new from that which God created in the previous moment or previously created. And this creating, this successive moment by moment creating, is beginningless. God has always been creating and will always create. That's the origin of the title of the lecture, Ever Creator or Ever Creation. God's always creating, there's always been creation, and God's always been the author or creator of it. Now, I think this new doctrine of creation can ground these deep convictions I and many other people have about God's love. It can say that God, the reason God's created is because God loves. That's God's very nature to love. God can't not love. And so love is the motive for God's creating. But it also says this method God uses is not unilateral. There's co-creating. God's not conjuring something out of absolutely nothing or coercing things that already are there. God is always working with creaturely co-creators or conditions in creation that have some kind of input or say in what emerges. The materials God then uses are actually creatures or creation. So, and that's something God had previously created. And finally, God necessarily creates. The mode of God's creating is necessary rather than contingent. It's everlasting rather than sporadic. And by the way, I've got this book coming out later this month in which I have a whole chapter in which I lay out some of these ideas. And that comes out the 25th of February. The upshot then, or the advantages of this view, is that the doctrine that says God always creates out of creation or in relation to creation in love, it can be consonant with Scripture, which always says God creates out of something. It says that God creates all things. There's nothing that God stumbles upon, happens upon. Nothing pre-exists God. Nothing actually exists that God didn't play some causal role in creating. Now, of course, God isn't the only cause of everything that exists. There's always creaturely causes, but nothing exists that God didn't play some causal role in creating. It also says that God doesn't depend upon creation for God's existence. Now, God depends in terms of love, but God exists necessarily, whereas creatures depend moment by moment upon God's creative activity, causal creative activity. God is the only one who exists necessarily and everlastingly. Here, let me take a moment to throw out an illustration that I've been toying with, and actually is in the new book that I mentioned earlier. When I say to people, God exists everlastingly and necessarily, but no creation, no world, no universe exists everlastingly, but God has always been creating. Well, they'll say, well, hold on a second. That means creation is co-eternal with God. And I say, well, in one sense, yes, but in a really important sense, no. Let me start with the no. No universe is eternal. No world is eternal. No creature, no entity is eternal. The series is everlasting, but no single one is everlasting. And here's my wild illustration. I live in southwest Idaho, and we have some wild horses out in an area called the Owahis. And I'm a photographer and hiker, and I like to hike out and try to find these horse herds. They're really amazing, and they've got interesting histories. But in these horse herds, a single stallion can sire generation after generation of foals. So here's my wild illustration to illustrate a God who exists a long time, but has creations that come and go. Imagine that there was a stallion in one of those wild horse herds that could live 10,000 years. Imagine that each of the mares that this stallion mated lived an average of, I don't know, 15 years, whatever an average horse life is. It's less out in the wild, but I'll say 15 to 20 years. And of course, given the mating, the mares would sire offspring, foals, fillies, colts, and the stallion would mate with the fillies, and they would have their own foals. And you get the idea. The mares would come and go. They would be born, they would die after 15, 20, maybe 25 years, but it would be the same stallion generation after generation. That's what I mean by a God who exists everlastingly. Obviously, stallions can't exist everlastingly. 10,000 years is not even possible, but you get the idea. A God who exists everlastingly, who's always co-creating with creaturely others that themselves aren't everlasting. They come into existence, they have a beginning. In that sense, they are not everlasting, but that chain of God's creating is everlasting. I don't know. Tell me what you think of that illustration. Number 5, this theory also says that the creator is different in some ways from creation, without those differences making God utterly incomprehensible. If that's an issue for some of you, I can explain more of that. And of course, this view says that God doesn't have to have the kind of controlling power, unilateral, single-handed, coercive power that would make God morally responsible or culpable for failing to prevent the genuine evils of the world. And it says that God's creating is always done with loving intentions, in loving relationship with creation, and with loving aims. This view, by the way, that there's always been some creation everlastingly, even though each bit of creation isn't itself everlasting, is drawing upon the same kind of logic most theists will use to say that God had no beginning. All I'm doing really is to say not only does God not have a beginning, but God's creating had no beginning. God's always been creating out of that which God previously created, and that creative series is everlasting. It says also that our particular universe did begin with a Big Bang, but there was something prior to our universe, likely the chaos of a previous through either freezing or frying, some kind of dying universe that came before. And finally, it says that our universe, although unique, is one series of universes that God creates. A couple of final points to wrap up my presentation. I've been working with the questions of God's power and love for quite some time. And 5 or 6 years ago, I published a book called The Uncontrolling Love of God, in which I took this idea of kenosis that we find in Scripture, especially Philippians chapter 2 in the Christian Scriptures, and which says that God is self-giving. And I've made the claim that God's self-giving and others empowering makes it the case that God simply cannot control others. In other words, it's a way to, what I think, solve the central question in the problem of evil. The problem of evil says, why doesn't a powerful God who loves everyone and everything prevent genuine evil? I say God simply can't, because God's love is always self-giving and others empowering, and therefore God can't control others. That's what essential kenosis means. In this new book, I've offered a new idea, what I'm calling essential hesed. Hesed is the Hebrew word for the steadfast love or the loyal love of God that we find in the Hebrew scriptures. And I make the claim that this steadfast love, which the psalmist says endures forever, is something God must do because it's God's very nature to do so. So to say that the steadfast love of the Lord endures forever is that God's covenant with creation is something that comes from God's very nature. And when we combine those two ideas, I can say it's because of God's love for creation and because it's literally forever, everlasting. God has always been creating others in which God can love. So, my conclusion, in a nutshell, the God in whom love comes first always and necessarily creates out of or in relation to that which God previously created. This loving God is the ever creator in relation to ever creation. Looking forward to hearing your comments and questions.
Thanks so much. That was really dynamic and exciting presentation.
Thank you.
We now have a respondent, and this respondent is Ricky Ballou, who graduated from the University of Virginia with a Bachelor of Science degree in chemistry, and then went to the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana, did a PhD in physical chemistry. He's worked in biotechnology, pharmaceutical industries. He's worked with some of the big companies like Curagen and AstraZeneca and MedImmune. He's held positions in technology development, laboratory automation, information technology. He's a certified lay servant in the Central Maryland District of the Baltimore-Washington Annual Conference of the United Methodist Church. It's really our great pleasure to have with us today Ricky Ballou. Ricky, please unmute and show your video.
Okay, thank you. Someone needs to allow me to start my video. There we go. So thank you. It's a great pleasure and privilege to be with you this evening and to respond to Tom's excellent proposal. My background is in chemistry, and I would like to introduce two chemistry concepts to the conversation and one theological concept that also applies. And without having had a preview of tonight's proposal, I am absolutely delighted and with the remarkable similarities between my own initial thoughts upon being invited to be the respondent this evening and the material that was presented. The first concept from chemistry that I would like to introduce has parallels in physics along the lines of the Big Bang, a singular event in which there is a change, something happens. And that concept is nucleation. So nucleation is defined as the first formation of local order within a system. And that local order, from the standpoint of chemistry, relates to a thermodynamic change in the system. So if we consider examples of nucleation, those span quite a wide range of chemical and chemistry, as well as everyday phenomena. For those of us who are in the Northern Hemisphere experiencing temperatures below 32 Fahrenheit or 0 degrees Celsius, nucleation may be seen with any water that is outside as ice forms. That begins from a single point and leads to the snow that we see, the ice that forms, as an example. Similarly, solutions of salt in aqueous solutions of salt may form crystals from single points that occur either spontaneously or through the introduction of some seed to initiate that process. We see that with the release of gas dissolved in liquids with anyone who has observed the Mentos in a Diet Coke to energetically release the gas and to produce that fountain. This also extends to highly complex biological systems that are the mechanics of life as we know it. Given simply the protein sequence, the sequence of amino acids in a protein that is unfolded will find its native state spontaneously in solution. Complex biological structures with essential life-giving function can form spontaneously from this nucleation. Beyond nucleation, and well aligned with this idea of ever creation, is that of equilibrium. Processes in chemistry are reversible. They exist in equilibrium, influenced by the conditions to which they are exposed, temperature, pH, other parameters can influence and cause an equilibrium to shift one way or another in a reaction. So there is this continuous action within a system that we might otherwise view as potentially static. The third concept that I would like to introduce along theological lines is that of being made in the image of God, extending to the idea that we may be co-creators with God. And I think of in my own experiences as a young chemist, I recall working in the laboratory, creating a reaction mixture that I hoped would contain the product that I desired after many hours of work. A reaction that in and of itself very much resembled the starting materials and was indistinguishable upon the introduction of a seed crystal to crystallize that product, produced what was hoped for, with the idea of something being transformed, creating something new, and potentially creating something good, something that was suitable and fit for purpose. Along those lines of making observations and being limited in terms of my own senses to be able to detect until this event happened, I am reminded that we are part of creation. We are of that creation, and that transformation of a new creation may in and of itself reveal that creation. And with those thoughts, I would like to propose that are there, or ask the question of whether there are concepts of within nucleation and equilibrium that that Tom would like to respond to in terms of developing his ideas around not creation from nothing, but creation from something that is transformed.
Thanks so
That's
much, Ricky. That was really great. And Tom, I guess we'll give you the chance to respond to that question first.
Yeah, I'll be fairly brief. Thanks so much, Ricky. That's great stuff. You know a lot more about chemistry than I do, but these ideas of equilibrium and nucleation fit very nicely with the kind of proposal that I have on the table, insofar as there's in the nucleation, as you said, it's something new in the locale of a broader system. So there's something already present from which nucleation is oriented toward. And of course, similarly with equilibrium. So yeah, I think those ideas work very nicely. They're doing the important scientific work, I think, and putting some kind of flesh on the more theoretical or abstract framework that I've put on the table. So thank you very much. I also think that the idea of us being made in God's image, and that might include co-creating, I'm totally on board with that. And I have no problem extending that beyond the human species to just about everything that exists. Now, I would want to say that humans have a greater complexity in their co-creating. The range of possibilities are likely much greater than the amoeba, for instance, or a mouse. But it seems like if we say that creaturely organisms are responding in any sense to their environment, even at the smaller chemical levels, there's some kind of maybe not agency, but integrity, some sort of spontaneity, maybe is a better word for when we talk about the smaller levels of chemistry. So there's even that co-creating going on there, which really raises the big question of, how wide is this image of God thing? Is it just for the human species, or can we say just about everything? And of course, that's a big question. We could follow that if we want to, but I won't try to solve it here.
Great. Thanks
Well,
so much.
I think I'll stop there. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tom. We have some questions already in the Q&A, and I want to remind our viewers that you can feel free to enter questions into the Q&A, and we'll try to take them. There are a couple of physics questions that I'm sort of going to lump together, although I won't read them all at once because it'll be too complicated. The first one's from Paul Carr. Isn't your claim supported by modern physics? Nothingness is the quantum vacuum. One of those fluctuations could have been the Big Bang.
It very well aligns with that. Of course, there are a variety of options in contemporary physics, but I like to cherry pick sometimes, just like everybody does. So I'll go with Paul Steinhardt, Neil Turok, Princeton and Cambridge physicists who have something like a cyclical universe that can fit with my view. And there's some others on the table, but yeah, I think I don't want to say all of physics supports what I propose, but I can turn to some models and say, yep, that fits really nicely with what I've got.
Great. And related to that, John Layden asked, I've always had a problem with the question, what was there before the Big Bang? How can the question make sense if time is created with the Big Bang?
Yeah, so the kind of the classic view here, coming from Augustine, is that time begins with God creating out of nothing. Now, of course, he didn't have Big Bang thought, but many of the folks who want to affirm creation out of nothing link it to Big Bang. And so then the question, in fact, Augustine says this of himself. He says, for those people who ask me, what was God doing before creation? He said, well, that's a nonsense question because there was no time. My view doesn't have to talk about the beginning of time, because time will be everlasting, because God is everlastingly creating. So I don't have to answer the question, what was God doing before God was creating? God's always been creating.
Great, thank you. And then Alexander Shenderovs asks, quantum foam concept by John Wheeler is a quantum mechanical idea of continuous creation out of nothing. Most of what's created is not viable, so it collapses upon itself incredibly fast. Some survives, though. And I guess he's asking what you think of this.
Yeah, when I think of Wheeler, I think of his famous "it from bit." Um, I don't know John's work well enough to know if by creation out of nothing he means absolutely, literally nothing. There are some theologians who will say, "I believe in creation out of nothing," but what they mean is that the nothingness was disorder or chaos or forms or possibilities or something. So I can't respond well to what Wheeler had in mind there, except that his sort of big idea suggests there was something that it comes from.
Okay, great, thank you. Grace Wolf Chase asks, what happens to eschatology? Does eschatology fit into this new doctrine?
Yeah, what a fantastic question. That's something, Grace, I've been working at for a while. So let me throw out some ideas. If there is life after death, which I think is a plausible possibility, one wonders what this life would be like. I think of it in terms of subjective immortality. And I think that something like, I'm fine with talking about our minds continuing on. Since I think minds have both a physical and mental dimension, it wouldn't be a purely Gnostic sort of view. There would still be a physicality involved, but the kind of physicality of a mind is obviously pretty different from the physicality of a rock or the bodies. So anyway, we would still have personal immortality. So that kind of eschatological vision is still on the table. If we think that other creatures have something like minds, maybe we'll say sentient creatures have mind-like capacities. Maybe all of them can survive death as well. So this eschatological view is bigger than just humans. But it does create a little bit problem from my view to talk about, let's say, rocks having immortality. Now, I think a lot of theists don't spend much time worrying about rocks in the afterlife. So it's not like a knock against my view. But I wish I could say with the Apostle Paul that absolutely everything gets redeemed. And if redemption for rocks means an afterlife, I got to admit, my theory, I have a hard time getting my head around that. But as I said, I think most theories have a hard time with that. So I'm not so worried about it.
Thanks, Tom. I have my own question I want to throw in here.
Good.
So, my favorite theologian is Sergei Bulgakov, who died around 1949. And a lot of your ideas resonate with things that he's said, okay?
Cool.
So he believed that there was never a time when God was not creator.
Really?
Yeah, and he also saw from an eschatological view, he saw that there was a kind of continuity that all of creation would be redeemed, and he goes and addresses questions like, if there is such a thing as a devil, would the devil be redeemed? And he says something like, no God that loves could ever create something that's not redeemed. And he even talks about like how wouldn't it be so unfair if the devil only did bad things in time and then he suffers blame for all eternity. It's not even a fair punishment. So you might want to check out his work. He's been translated into English in the past probably 10 years a lot. There's a new book on sociology of death that just came out by him, but I think you'll find that your ideas might resonate. It might be worth looking at if you haven't seen him already.
Can you help me spell his last name?
It's Bulgakov. K-O-V. First name is Sergius, S-E-R-G-I-U-S.
Actually, have you and I talked about this? Because that name sounds familiar.
It could be possible because
Yeah.
I would have brought him up in
Yeah.
conversations about this. So I'm now reading this new book on eschatology, and it's amazing. So
Cool. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. Once I saw the letters of his name, I thought, I think I've seen that before. Yeah. Thank you so much.
great, great. Let me give you another question. Paul Carr says, God may not control, but doesn't God lure creation toward greater beauty and complexity?
Yeah, that's my view. I'll use a variety of verbs in addition to lure. Yeah, I think it's not that this God who doesn't control is, the God of deism who's watching from Mars from a distance or something. I think God is always active in every moment, in every entity, in every universe at all times, but never in a controlling way. And that action is always wooing, luring, coaxing, creating, calling. I got all kinds of verbs I can use, so long as those verbs don't end up making it sound as if God is in some sense unilaterally determining or single-handedly bringing about consequences or coercion in that sense. So yeah, the God I believe in, I'm even comfortable, I know this makes some of my friends nervous, but I'm even comfortable saying this God is almighty, so long as this almightiness doesn't mean controlling. So I like to say God is almighty in the sense of being mightier than any others. So God, to use the language of the Psalms, God has no equals. God is almighty in the sense of exerting might or influence on all others. No other creature can do that. God is almighty in the sense of being a necessary cause in every moment. So no other creature does that, or so I should say, no creature does that. If I'm careful, I can even use some of that language. I shy away from omnipotent because of so many connotations people have with that word. But yeah, that's what I would think, Paul. Thanks for your question.
Great. Next question is from Jay Atkinson. So is universalism an unavoidable implication of your scheme?
Yeah, I have a theory of the afterlife. This kind of gets back to Grace's question as well. That is not what I would call classical universalism. When I say classical universalism, I mean something like maybe Karl Barth would have in mind, or even David Bentley Hart, in which they assume God has the kind of omnipotent power that makes God able, either at the beginning of creation out of nothing in their views, God sets things up such that eventually everything will necessarily be redeemed, or God has the kind of power that God during the process can just say, everybody go to heaven, ollie income free, or whatever that looks like. I don't have a God with that kind of power, or a God who creates out of nothing. So I have a God who never gives up in the call for love in this life and the next. That means that I don't have the kind of guarantee that could come with a God of omnipotence, but I have the real possibility for universalism, Jay. So I have a hopeful universalism in the sense that God never gives up inviting any sentient being capable of responding to love. God never says, I've worked with Gail for 7 million years, I'm giving up on her. No, God always works and continues. So I have the hope of universal reconciliation, but not the kind of guarantee. And if I just could say one more thing about that, I find this actually, it's a better way to think about how our lives and choices are matter, have ultimate significance. If God's got the kind of omnipotence to guarantee everybody goes to the good place, then does my choices right now really matter that much? Because everything's going to work out fine in the end. Whereas in my view, God doesn't have that kind of power. So I really need to cooperate with the lure of love. And unless I don't, things aren't going to end up well for everyone. So I think it creates a certain kind of responsibility that I find more helpful.
Great, thanks for that. Maynard has his hand up. He wants to ask a question. Maynard. Maynard, you have to unmute.
Tom, I'm really pleased that you connected the notion of kenosis with the Hebrew word hesed. I think that enriches actually both concepts together.
Good.
When I read scripture and try to put it all together, it comes out, I guess I'm a Trinitarian, faith, hope, and love.
Mm.
So that they go together, and just as important as kenosis, as the ever creating and ever loving and the self-giving God, is the notion of hope, because God comes to me out of the future. And without that lure into the future, I have no hope, and my faith really has no fruition.
Yeah.
So the notions together are really rich in my view, and really important to hold together. So that to say that God is love, God is also the source of hope for the future.
I like that a lot. I like that hope. And I was trying to sort of capture some of that when I was talking about the universalism question that Jay and Grace were kind of pointing to with eschatology. Maynard, you and I share a theological heritage in John Wesley. And something Wesley said helped me as I thought through the implications of a God of uncontrolling love trying to lure everyone to salvation and the hopefulness. And while you were speaking, I was thinking of this, and I quickly pulled it up. And let me read just about two or three. I guess it's just two sentences in his sermon, "The General Spread of the Gospel." John Wesley says this: "In the same manner as God has converted so many to himself without destroying their liberty, he can undoubtedly convert whole natures or the whole world. And it is as easy for him to convert a whole world as one individual soul," unquote. What I like about that is that, I sometimes get a little, what's the opposite of hope? Depressed, unhopeful. Sometimes I look at what happens in the world and I think, oh man, are we going to come out of this thing? Are some people going to respond to God's love and act differently? God, I think, wants to save everyone, wants to convert all souls, to use Wesley's language. And then I think to myself, I think God is trying to convert me, and I'm doing the best I can, at least most of the time, to respond to this call of love. Why think that God can't also convert others in the world, that others aren't also capable of responding to God? I'm surely not any better than anyone else. And especially if I think God's love never, ever gives up in this life or the next. So in my way of thinking, that's a hopeful scenario, Maynard, that the persuasive love of God that I believe is converting me right now is capable of converting everyone. In fact, to use Wesley's language, the whole world.
Great, thank you. Tom, there's a last question here from Jeffrey Milsheim. Your concepts do not make God capable for failing to prevent evils, and that God always creates with loving motives. But animals kill and eat other animals. Wolves and lions kill and eat the horses. How do you reconcile these facts?
Yeah, I think there's genuine evils in the world outside of what humans, agents, do. I think that there are ways of existing in creation that aren't as good as they could be. I imagine a day in which humans and lions don't devour other creatures. So there may be aspects of the created order. There's always going to be death. It seems that seems to be the way the world is set up. We're always going to have to eat something to continue surviving. So there's always going to be that sort of thing. But the illustrations you mentioned seem to be violent kind of deaths that go beyond what's simply necessary for survival. And I can imagine, sometimes it's difficult for me, but I can imagine a future in which that kind of unnecessary violence, even amongst lions and wolves, isn't a part of the created reality. And here I've got a wild speculation on this. So I like to think about philosophy of science issues a lot, top down, bottom up causation. And there's that passage in Romans, I believe it's chapter 9, but some of you might help me out here, talks about all of creation groaning, waiting for I think it has the masculine language, the sons of God or something like that. And the idea is that creation is somehow dependent upon humans to get their act together. At least that's how I interpret it. It's a kind of a strange set of verses, I admit. But I start to think about downward causation. That is, it could be that even the other creatures on the planet could move into kind of a harmonious ways of living if humans could become harmonious in their ways of living. At least that seems philosophically a reasonable proposal. So it's part of the hope that I have for the future.
Great. Thanks so much, Tom. I mean, I think this is a really good note to end our session on. I want to thank you, and I want to thank Ricky for really a beautiful response as well. This has been a great opportunity for us.